All right, let's stay with the topic of unemployment, with the country's worsening unemployment crisis. Women and this particular gender, if we could put it like that, they are the worst affected. You only have to look at the numbers from Stats SA. We're going to discuss this now, and joining us for this conversation is Tony Healy. He is a labour expert. He's in studio with me, and on the virtual platform, we're joined by Emmanuelle Mgiba. She is with the program manager at Girl Effect South Africa. To both of you, thank you very much for your time. Tony, I want to start in studio. The worsening unemployment picture in the country. What is the possible solution here? Are we able to lift ourselves out of this crisis, you think?
Well, I think that the outlook is perhaps more positive, if I could use that word, than it may have been a few months ago. We do have amongst the highest unemployment rate in the world. Why would I suggest there may be a silver lining? Is because during the period of the previous government of national unity, unemployment figures were on average about 15% below what they are today. So I think we could look back and say what levers were pulled then, and can we replicate those? But I do think much more needs to be done, because it really is a national crisis and nothing has been done. And we know that because we've been living with approximately 4 out of 10 South Africans being unemployed for about 20 years. So that's an extraordinary crisis. Yeah. And I think it requires extraordinary policy intervention.
Emmanuelle, let's bring you into the conversation. Women in South Africa are said to be the ones who are bearing the brunt of unemployment. We'll come to that in a second. But your general view, Tony Healy, who's sitting with me in studio, is saying there's a silver lining. There does seem to be some hope on the horizon. Do you share the same view?
Yeah, I think I definitely share the same view. I mean, the numbers are what the numbers are, right? So I think Tony raises a good point, that there's a silver lining. But what I'd just like to reiterate is what he mentioned around policy and the need for there to be quite stringent policy is being implemented, not only drafted, but implemented to ensure that we do see an increase in unemployment across the board. So that's what I'd like to emphasize on. I think there's definitely a silver lining, but insofar as we don't see a transition from the policy that we have on paper, the interventions that are currently in place, as long as we don't see the link between those things and the actual lived experiences of South Africans, I think there is still cause for worry, despite there being a silver lining.
Yeah. Tony, is there a difference between unemployment and underemployment? I don't want to really play with semantics in this discussion because it's such a sensitive one, but I just wondered whether there is a marked difference between these two definitions.
Well, I think, it is a technical issue. I don't know so much, Xoli, that it affects the overall statistic of a 40% unemployment rate. You could argue that the youth are underemployed and unemployed. Some are employed, but not enough.
Yeah.
But I think for me, and I would think for the unemployed, the real question is, I think we've rightly heard as well from our other panelists, is what policies are being put in place to urgently address a crisis. I mean, we could use the example of electricity. I mean, it was odd to have a minister of electricity. We've never had that before. It sounded peculiar. If we look back, we have to say to ourselves, you know what, that's actually, the incumbent has been competent, yes, but the unemployment crisis is no less significant. And could there not, for example, be, not that we need a broader cabinet, but a minister of unemployment? Because even if you look at the recent stats, 158,000 jobs have been lost but that affects probably over 1 million mouths. So this is a national crisis, and I think we need to see extraordinary policy change, much more than we've seen in the last 20 years to address this.
So let's then try and get to grips with the policy interventions. If you look at the Northwest Province, the unemployment figures there, Kosatu was explaining just before we started the conversation, that in that province there are more people who are unemployed than those who are in employment, and the picture with these latest statistics has actually gotten worse. What kind of intervention would need to be introduced in terms of policy to address a matter so urgent in that province?
Well, I think, Xoli, there's a number of things that need to be done. I don't think there's a single intervention that could necessarily move the needle back in the right direction.
Yeah.
But I think you could look at various things. And I think a good place to start, for example, is our labour law regime. So we pride ourselves on having progressive labour legislation that promotes job security,
Yeah.
which is fair enough if you're employed. But if you're not employed, it has absolutely no benefit for you whatsoever. So there do need to be protections, but the extent to which we have protections, I think, influences or detracts from our ability to have labour flexibility.
Yeah.
And we have minimum wage legislation, which I think to a large degree discourages employment. You know, Xoli, we have 3 different regimes when it comes to minimum wages. We have national minimum wage, we have bargaining council agreements, and we have wage determinations, and they're often at odds with each other. You know, if we could look at that, remove that, lower taxes, for example, this may or may not be a way, but lower taxes for companies in labour-intensive industries. So hospitality, for example, agriculture, retail. Something needs to give, something significant needs to be executed for there to be a significant reduction in the unemployment rate. Otherwise, we're going to go from 34 to 35.5 to 34 to 33 to 34 for the next 20 years.
Emmanuelle, I'd like to talk about the people who are over the age of 35. These are people who can't go back to school, as in secondary education. So, for example, if you are 35 and you don't have a matric, I doubt that there is any hope that you could go back to school unless, I guess, you get into the ABET sort of category of people. These are people who have been defined as the forgotten nation. Talk to us about these people, and is enough being done to try and address their plight, because they sort of find themselves in no man's land, so to speak?
Yeah, such a great question. And I think you've put it correctly. They do find themselves in a no man's land. You find that there are a plethora of interventions being put in place for young people who are unemployed, and rightly so. But then you do find that we have the over 35s who are still struggling to find employment and struggling to find interventions that can assist. I think there are 2 things at play here. The first is just the general stigma around going back to non-conventional education. So there are systems in place, adult education centers that one can go to upskill, reskill, and then try by all means to integrate back into the workforce. Those exist, however, there are not enough of them, that being the first thing. And 2, there is definitely a stigma around them. So those are the issues at play there. The other dynamic when it comes to the lost generation or the no man's land is how are employers viewing the over 35s? You find that in certain sectors, there is an aversion towards hiring older for a number of reasons, just inaccurate perceptions that perhaps they're not be able to keep up, perhaps they're not technologically enabled, etc., etc. But you'll find that, there is an aversion to employing the over 35s. So these are the dynamics at play. I do think that there is a call and a real need for there to be more interventions for the over 35s. What exactly these interventions look like, I'm not entirely sure. I think there needs to be an increased push around adult education, reskilling, upskilling. But then I also think those that are working in the youth unemployment space should share learnings with people who are devoting their time to the over 35s and see what can be drawn out of those spaces and how we can build programs and systems to assist that generation.
Yeah. Tony, I'm going to ask you in a moment about companies insisting on work experience. So for a person who is over the age of 35, they've never been employed in their lives, and you come, or they come knocking to your door as the employer, and you demand work experience. We'll come to that in a moment, but talk to us about what Emmanuelle has just addressed, that perhaps these people are, it's sort of unfair for them to find themselves unemployable in a country that has a huge unemployment problem, and yet they are young still.
Yes, listening to Emmanuelle, she makes a number of very good points. If you look at the over 35 age group, let's not forget, that's a huge cohort. That's 35 to 65. That's a 30-year range. So it may be difficult to talk about a 38-year-old job applicant versus a 58-year-old job applicant. I mean, I think that if age is an issue for an employer, it's less of an issue if they're 38 and 48 than they would be if they were 58. We do have age discrimination law, which is quite powerful in terms of its ability to address age discrimination.
Yeah.
But yes, I think thinking anecdotally, there is an aversion to employing more mature-aged job applicants than there is to employing a younger age cohort.
Work experience? Do you think companies should do away with that? Political rhetoric, especially in the lead up to the elections, has sort of been pointing toward that direction. I think it was the Secretary General of the ANC, Fikile Mbalula, who said this, that this whole issue around work experience is something that perhaps should be relooked.
I think, again, that depends on the job that's being filled. There are certainly many jobs where you would want a new appointee to be able to hit the road running and be able to take over from a predecessor in a particular area that does require a degree of experience and insight and know-how.
Yeah.
Of a particular vocation or a particular sector. If you are a housekeeper or a housekeeper manager in a hotel, or if you are a foreman on a building site, you would not be able to come in and manage, for example, artisans if you haven't had some experience or supervisory skill experience or experience as an artisan yourself. But I think there are other jobs, Xoli, where the question of job experience is overemphasized.
Yeah.
And it certainly could be relaxed in areas, for example, where you're perhaps talking of a lesser skilled position or a position which, with a relatively short training and development period, could close the gap between the need for experience and a job applicant who doesn't have that experience.
Yeah. I'd like for us to take a break, because when we return, Emmanuelle, we're now going to try and get to grips with why it is that women in South Africa are the ones shouldering the burden of unemployment. I mean, we now even have research that talks about the feminization of poverty. We'll discuss that in a moment. You're watching News at Prime. We continue to discuss the unemployment rates in the country, and we're going to change tack a little bit and discuss now the differentiation between male and female, why it is that women are the ones who bear the brunt of unemployment when it comes to these statistics. Still with me for this conversation, Tony Healy is a labor expert sitting with me in studio, and on the virtual platform, Emmanuelle Mgiba, and she is with the program, or should I say the organization it's called Girl Effect South Africa. She is a program manager there. Emmanuelle, let's come to you. I'm going to start by quoting the statistics, and this is over a 10-year period. These are statistics, South Africa figures. They are suggesting that, firstly, a larger proportion of people entering the labor market are facing unemployment, and then they break it down between male and female. For men, in this 10-year period, so if you look back to 2014, 15.2% of men were unemployed, and then you go to 2024, that figure rises to 20.7%. For women, the gap has expanded more rapidly, rising from 14.0% in 2014 to 20.0% in 2024. Do we know why it is that women seem to bear the brunt of unemployment?
Yeah, it's a good question, but also a very complex one to answer. I'll start by answering it this way. People who experience unemployment or any kind of social ill really experience it differently because our lived experiences are intersectional. So I remember the last time we were talking, I gave you a stat where over 20% of women are infected with HIV versus just over 13% in men. This is at the time that the study was done. So when it comes to HIV infection, you're seeing a gap where women bear the brunt of it. And then similarly here with employment, there's a gap as well, quite a significant one, with women bearing the brunt of it. And underpinning that, you can see that, okay, the common thread here is that women are bearing the brunt of these social ills. And why is that? My proposition here is that it is a symptom of a very broken system that we live in. And what underpins that system is patriarchy. And patriarchy really just speaks to where does power sit when it comes to gender dynamics between men and women. And the fact that it sits with men means that certain positions of power, even certain policies, whatever the case might be, skew to benefit men more than they do women.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think that there's a huge gap there when it comes to gender dynamics, the feminization of policy, and the like. How this manifests then is that it influences what type of jobs that women can access, and access primarily when they do even get into the workforce. And that's if they even get there. There's a particular stat, I forget the number, but a study was done and it indicated that the majority of entry-level jobs are occupied primarily by women as opposed to men. This obviously feeds into earning capacity and the like. And then they did a study into executive level and they saw that there was a measly amount, just about 20-something%, I think maybe just over 25% of executives across the country are women. And so you can see that these gender dynamics filter into every aspect of employment, every aspect of economic empowerment. And like I said, it really is just symptomatic of a broken system. And that system is patriarchy. And I can give many, many examples of how it influences women's employment prospects. I'll just give one before I give Tony a chance to input. But even if you look at education, So the number of women that actually access institutions of higher learning versus men, the number of women that actually progress, when it comes to early childhood development, a lot of factors at play here, but like I said, all symptomatic of a very broken system.
Yeah, I'll come back to you with those other examples, but Tony, patriarchy, that's the symptom, at least identified so far. Let's then try to deal with that, because research tells us that this is because women are more likely to take on household duties. They are also likely to deal with the child rearing and other responsibilities that limit their opportunities into the labor market. Will we ever find a balance here?
Well, I think that's very true, and we still do see it today, and we just need to look at the unemployment figures of women to see that verified. Certainly anecdotally, I see it in my practice, and we see it in the numbers in the Employment Equity Commission statistics and the kind of numbers that Emmanuelle is showing us. But there are ways of addressing that, even though it's a big challenge. And Emmanuelle raised, I think, a very important issue, which I would kind of describe as the pipeline. Where are we sourcing the skills? Where are we sourcing the suitable job applicants from? Yeah. So, for example, yes, engineering students, how is that being managed? How is the demographic of that being managed? Another example, I saw a stat recently, and I don't know, can't recall the right numbers, but it was more or less something like this that said in the IT space and job category, about 90% are men. Now, why is that? Why is that? Is it because I think you need to look back at the pipeline system and say, right to the universities, the TVET colleges, et cetera. What are you doing to ensure that the pipeline of skilled and qualified IT experts that's coming through the system, it more accurately reflects the demographic of the nation in which we live? Because if you can start to address it there, then my sense is it would start to manifest itself in a more equitable distribution of male and female IT experts, and the same I think could apply to any other industry.
Emmanuelle, let's come to you. It's interesting that Tony uses the example of IT. Are you able to tell us that perhaps there are more male figures that are graduating as IT engineers versus female? Because I suspect there is a larger figure of women or females coming through than that of men.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, I'll only be able to speak anecdotally, really, when it comes to IT and also just STEM overall. I think the reason why there's been such a push around women in STEM, you see a lot of organizations pushing mathematics, technology, engineering, science for young girls and women, is because there has been quite a big gap where it's a line, or fields rather, that have been more geared towards men. You see the tide leaning more towards men occupying those spaces or pursuing those kinds of roles. So I don't have the stats exactly. It is anecdotal. It's based on what I've seen myself, but also based on where attention is being placed in the development space. So because there's so much attention around women in STEM, increasing the visibility and number of women that enter into those fields, I could say that there is a gap that needs to be filled.
Tony, the balance in the workplace, or should we say equality in the workplace, is that wishful thinking that we will never really reach an equilibrium purely because of some of what Emmanuelle has had to say, and that is that patriarchy still plays a huge role in who gets employed and how far advanced do they get in the ladder?
I think, unfortunately, that is true. And it's a terrible thing, perhaps, to have to admit. We have employment equity legislation, which has been with us for a mere 24, 25 years. We're dealing with decades, if not longer, of a patriarchal society over maybe even centuries. And it's not necessarily going to reverse in 24 or 25 years. That said, and it's somewhat controversial in some quarters, the employment equity legislation, but be that as it may, it has had some benefits when it comes to progressing previously disadvantaged groups. Not as much as is desired, but it has, and one of them is women. So the Employment Equity Act looks at three previously disadvantaged cohorts: persons with disabilities, Black South Africans, and women, who are often forgotten in the equation. And perhaps if there was a greater oversight of the progress that employers are making for the sake of our discussion, women, then my sense is that, and there were consequences of not showing some degree of progress. I think employers would then take that a little more seriously.
Yeah.
It's not a silver bullet, but it's, and I think all the other areas we've discussed of training and development and education and all the pipelining. But I do think it's another string to the bow in terms of trying to address this question of the underrepresentation of women in the workplace.
Quickly before I move to Emmanuelle, with retrenchments, do we know how companies work this out as to who gets retrenched? Is it those that are last in, or does this actually even play in the gender space as to how workplaces decide on who gets retrenched?
I've been involved with retrenchment for decades, and I can honestly say to you that I have never been involved in a retrenchment exercise or process that has ever identified any demographic as being particularly targeted for retrenchment, be it females, be it the elderly, be it the youth. I have not come across that. Yeah. Typically, an employer would look at a whole host of factors. I have personally never seen gender being a selection factor or selection criteria when it comes to retrenchment.
Yeah. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we return, yes, we'll be wrapping the discussion, but I'd like to put this this term, feminization of poverty, I'll put that to Emmanuelle. And then, Tony, you get to tell us, the UIF commissioner was speaking today, particularly to this channel, about the pressure that the issue of unemployment is having on their fund. Are employers cooperating or doing things in line with the law? In other words, contributing to the UIF, because we're seeing more and more cases of people not being able to claim from the UIF. If you're just joining us, we are wrapping up a discussion on the crisis of unemployment in South Africa. Tony Healy is a labor expert. He's with me in studio. Emmanuelle Mgiba is a program manager at Girl Effect South Africa. Emmanuelle, let me come to you next. Feminization of poverty, if you consider all of what we have discussed and the burden of unemployment on women, do you think that that indeed does ring true, that there is almost a feminization of poverty, particularly in South Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's good that you added particularly in South Africa, because I think it is in South Africa that it runs even more rampant because of our Gini coefficient, right? It's one of the highest in the world. And so the feminization of poverty at face value can look like a very complex phenomenon, but it really just speaks to a trend of increasing inequality between men and women when it comes to the standard of living. And based on the stats you were giving me that we got from Stats SA, that is really what we're seeing. From 10 years ago till now, we are seeing that there is increasing inequality between men and women. So although there's increasing unemployment, the gap that exists between men and women when it comes to unemployment continues to widen. And so like with any developmental or systematic issue, it starts with a pipeline. And I think Tony mentioned the term pipeline, which rings true, where the feminization of poverty doesn't just start at employment level. It starts from education, and you've been speaking to that. So who gets to attend school, whether it be primary school or institutions of higher learning? Then it goes to who actually gets hired. And we know that there are many employers that have inherent biases when it comes to hiring. Their practices are not ethical. And so they would choose to hire a man over a woman because of whatever opinions or thoughts that they have around the competence of women in the workplace. And then once you cross that hurdle of actually being employed, then you have the issue of how do I then progress within the workplace? And that's when you see the widening gap between those that make it to executive level, our higher earners, and then those that stay at entry level or middle management levels despite working for decades.
Yeah.
And so the feminization of poverty, it is a systematic issue. It's a developmental issue. It is real, and I think the numbers are showing it. And in order to solve it, I think it does require a multi-stakeholder effort, like many developmental issues do, where we have people from the beginning of the pipeline putting in interventions right up until the end.
Yeah. Tony, while we were on the break, you brought up a completely different complexion to the question I was going to ask about the UIF coming under pressure in the situation of unemployment. But let me phrase it in your way then. The labor law regime in South Africa, is it fit for purpose in the situation of rising unemployment?
Well, the point I was making to you, I mean, my answer to that question is it isn't. And let me give you a couple of examples. You mentioned the UIF. Now, we have a 2% contribution to UIF from salaries, 1% from the employer and 1% from the employee, and that goes into a kitty, and if you're unemployed, you can dip into the kitty for a few months. That never envisaged a 40% unemployment rate, where so many would be dipping into the kitty to the extent that it depletes completely because of the extent and gravity of the number of unemployed people. It was never ever catered for that.
Just out of interest, before you continue, how much sits in that kitty?
I don't know that number, Dolly, to be perfectly honest. I don't know that number. But I can give you another example. So we have labor legislation, and by the way, protection of job security is important. Of course it's important. But I think if you look at our labor relations regime, it is so regulated, so extreme in favor of job protection, it ignores its impact on job creation. So, for example, the CCMA has, the last time I looked, 800 to 900 referrals of labor disputes a day. A day. Now, that's spawned by the labor legislation. It's our strict dismissal laws, it's unfair labor practice laws, which are strict. They need to be there. I don't know if they need to be this strict, but they do need to be there.
Yeah.
So what, you might ask? Well, the so what, the answer to that question is that you now sit with a CCMA that's had its budget decimated, and there's insufficient funds to employ enough commissioners to manage the day-to-day activities of, you just need to speak to the CCMA. They would tell you themselves, if you brought them on, that their budget, so we can't afford the labor dispute resolution infrastructure that's been created because of the over-regulation that we have. So I'm not for a moment suggesting take away job security protection, but as I said earlier, it's all fair and well talking about how well protected the employed are, but it serves as a disincentive to employ for employers, and it has no benefit whatsoever for the 4 out of 10 South Africans who are unemployed.
Emmanuelle, let's conclude the conversation with you. Inputs on how we can turn around the situation in the country. I mean, perhaps the more obvious question there would be the economy has got to perform in order for people to be absorbed into employment. But we are where we are right now with our economy. So any quick fixes from your end?
I wish there were quick fixes, but unfortunately there aren't. When it comes to the economy and driving economic growth, I think lowest hanging fruit there is just creating ease of doing business, right? For small businesses, but also for large enterprises. The easier it is for them to conduct business, the easier it is for them to grow and scale, the more people can get absorbed into the system. But then if you look at it from a developmental civil society lens, which is my area of expertise, there definitely is a need for us to integrate and work closely with private sector when it comes to tackling issues of unemployment. This is a model that the Youth Employment Service, Yes for Youth, has implemented with relative success. And so I think building on that, taking on the learnings from that organization is definitely something worth exploring. How can we, incentivize organizations that hire a large number of entry-level, employees? How do we integrate skills development programs for them that are subsidized? Things of that nature.
Yeah.
I think we can think big when you're thinking in the developmental space. And then last thing is, where are these interventions taking place? As someone who works in civil society, I know that the temptation is to intervene in the Western Cape, in Gauteng, in KZN, where we have larger populations, but then you get situations like the Northwest where interventions don't reach there and there's so much need. So also re-looking where these interventions are taking place is what I'd consider.
I want to thank you very much for your time, Emmanuelle Mgiba, and she is with the Girl Effect. It's an organization that specifically look at the very issues we are discussing, particularly the disproportionate burden of unemployment on women. She's a program manager there. Tony Healy, you've been with me in studio, labor expert. Thank you very much for making the time for this important discussion. In fact, I'm feeling guilty because one of the questions I should have asked is, how are we doing on the question of self-employment when you can't find work? How difficult is it to start your own thing? But we'll reserve that for another day. But thank you very much.